Hello there, welcome once again to our science lesson. We have been on a journey of trying to understand our systems, and for the systems to work together, we have always said that there must be a coordination. Coordination can only rise through the nervous system, and the nervous system work on a basic structural unit, which are the nerve cells or the neurons. In our previous lesson, we have just looked at the neurons. We identified them as sensory, motor, and relay neurons. But we said they work as a complex or as one, as a unit. For them to work as a unit, where there must be a way where they'll be linking. They usually link most of the time in the central nervous system. But there is no direct junction or direct joining of the neurons. We have a junction between dendrites of adjacent neurons. That junction is called the synapse. So for the purpose of this lesson, we are going to look at the synapse. So I've said if we have a nerve impulse flowing or being transmitted through neurons, for instance, from sensory neuron to relay neuron, there is a gap. If that is the sensory neuron, there is that gap. If this is sensory neuron, relay neuron, relay neuron has other names like connector neuron, like intermediate neuron, and then we have motor neuron. So impulse is flowing from this direction through this neuron, but there's always a gap in between the two or the three neurons. So that gap is what we are calling a synapse. So we should be wondering, how then is it possible that a nerve impulse can flow from sensory neuron to relay neuron and then to motor neuron, and yet there exists a gap in between any of adjacent dendrites of the neurons. So I want to find out what happens in the synapse and what are the functions. Why is it that we should have that gap? So by definition, a synapse is simply a gap. A synapse is a junction or a gap. A junction between dendrites of two adjacent neurons. So that junction is what you are calling the synapse. And that synapse usually allows transmission of nerve impulse from one neuron to another neuron, but in one direction. The direction will always be the way we have just shown on the board, from sensory neuron to relay neuron in the central nervous system to motor neuron, then to effector. We cannot have the reverse. So that one becomes one of the functions of the synapse. So we can just try to look at the structure of the synapse, and then thereafter we look at the function. So between adjacent or between dendrites of any adjacent neuron, we shall have this magnified structure that we are calling the synapse. So this part, for instance, if nerve impulse is flowing in this direction, then it gives us the names. This part is called presynaptic knob. Presynaptic knob. And then there's a membrane there. It's called presynaptic membrane. So they'll be labeled according to the direction of the nerve impulse. If it is flowing from this direction, then this one becomes presynaptic knob, presynaptic membrane. But suppose the impulse was flowing this direction to this, then this one becomes presynaptic. But now, because this is presynaptic knob, then we shall label this one as postsynaptic. Postsynaptic knob. And then that one now becomes the membrane after this name, post. Synaptic membrane. Postsynaptic membrane. Then that gap that's left now is given this name, synaptic cleft. Synaptic cleft. Just the way it is pronounced, it is also written in the same way. Now, in this presynaptic knob, we have vesicles. First of all, we have mitochondria. I'll use that one to show mitochondria. We know that mitochondria is the powerhouse. It's where respiration takes place to release ATP energy. And then now we have vesicles. Those vesicles have some chemicals. Those chemicals are called transmitter substance. Transmitter substance. So this is the structure of a synapse. Now, having known the structure of the synapse, then it becomes very easy for us to understand the mechanism by which an impulse will be transmitted across this synaptic cleft or across the synapse. So what will happen is this. Once we have a nerve impulse flowing from this direction, it will reach the synaptic knob. When it reaches the synaptic knob, it will stimulate the vesicles to release transmitter substance. But first of all, before the vesicles releases transmitter substance, they'll have to move. If it was one vesicle here, it will move close to presynaptic membrane. So we begin. The neuron has stimulated the vesicles to move closer to presynaptic membrane. After moving closer to presynaptic membrane, it releases transmitter substance. When transmitter substance is released, it makes presynaptic membrane to be permeable. It becomes permeable, meaning it will become easier for the ions. Remember, nerve impulse is in form of ions, alteration in ionic concentration in the axon. So it becomes permeable to the ions. So it reaches here and then it will release. So it releases. When it releases those transmitter substance, the membrane becomes permeable, and then now it allows the ions to flow across or into the synaptic cleft. The same transmitter substance will have the same effect on post-synaptic membrane. Now, when we have that cleft, that presynaptic membrane, postsynaptic membrane, allowing flow of ions, we call that condition as action potential. Action potential. Action potential, meaning without stimulation, there is nothing happening. There is no flow of nerve impulse across the cleft. But once the nerve impulse reaches there, then we are going to have an action potential. Something is happening. So there will be flow of ions across the presynaptic membrane and postsynaptic membrane under the influence of transmitter substance. So in that way, there will be flow or transmission of nerve impulse across the synapse. So the most important substance or substances is the transmitter substance. We are going to look at two types of substance. We have one of them is called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. Another substance is called noradrenaline. Noradrenaline. Sometimes in other literature, it will be cited either as acetylcholine or noradrenaline. So in form of a literature, we can indicate some notes on the same mechanism. Mechanism of impulse transmission across synapse. So briefly, we have said what will happen when impulse reaches the presynaptic knob. Presynaptic knob. It is going to stimulate the vesicles. Vesicles are stimulated. Vesicles are stimulated to move closer to presynaptic membrane. And in the process, the vesicles will release transmitter substance. Vesicles and then release transmitter substance. In this case, we have said the transmitter substance could be either this acetyl choline or noradrenaline. But again, there is something that moving, the movement of the vesicles. We have said we have the mitochondria. Mitochondria in the presynaptic knob are the one that produces energy so that now it can aid in the movement of the vesicles close to the presynaptic membrane. So vesicles releases transmitter substance. They affect presynaptic membrane, become permeable to nerve impulse. So when it becomes permeable to nerve impulse, we call this condition as being polarized. Therefore, the presynaptic membrane gets polarized. Gets polarized. So once it is polarized, once the presynaptic membrane is polarized, it will allow the nerve impulse to flow from presynaptic knob or from presynaptic or across the presynaptic membrane into the cleft. This allows impulse to flow to synaptic cleft. Synaptic cleft. So in the process, again, the same thing happens. Synaptic cleft will allow the ions or the nerve impulse to flow to the postsynaptic membrane. Impulse then flows to postsynaptic membrane into postsynaptic knob. Now, the whole action that's happening in the presynaptic knob and postsynaptic knob will now cause a nerve impulse to flow across the synapse, and that condition, we call it an action potential. This condition leads to action potential. In other words, action potential is just that state where an impulse can now be able to flow without any hindrance. Impulse is flowing across the gap. Impulse is transmitted across the gap. So you realize that there's one thing that's very important about that. If we have several impulses, suppose you have stepped on a sharp object, we must have a nerve impulse for sharp object or a pain as a result of sharp object. But suppose this sharp object was a nail that's hot. We have two stimuli, a sharp nail and a hot nail. Those are two different stimuli, that is. So there must be a way of differentiating those stimuli. They are not supposed to merge into one. Now, to avoid that merging, that's where the synapse comes in. The first impulse for pain as a result of stepping on a sharp object will be different because it will flow across the gap, and then acetylcholine is restored. And then later again, some few microseconds, which is already later, you realize that now we shall have pain maybe from a hot nail. So synapse is important because it prevents merging of nerve impulses as it flows across the synapse. Function or role of synapse. Role of synapse. One, I've already said that because impulses are flowing in intervals, it will allow, it is going to prevent merging of the impulses. Merging of impulses. So that one impulse that comes, or one stimuli that is detected after a short while to another is not interpreted as one. Otherwise, the body will not be able to respond to it appropriately. Then another role of synapse. Remember, we have designated the synapse as having pre and post synaptic knob, and they are named according to the direction. So we cannot have any other way such that now we have a postsynaptic knob at one point, and then again we have this one as post. We cannot have post and then this is post. Postsynaptic knob, postsynaptic knob. It cannot happen because impulse must always flow in one direction. So that's the role of synapse. It only allows flow of impulse in one direction. This is important. Otherwise, the brain can also be confused because we are supposed to, we have so many neurons, sensory numerous, relay numerous, motor neurons, so many of them. So the flow of impulse is supposed to be unidirectional, one direction. Then the other role of synapse is to allow a connection or to allow flow of impulse from one neuron to another. To another, and especially if they are adjacent. So these are the roles of the synapse. Now, having looked at this, then we can look at how the whole system of the nervous system functions using the three neurons across the synapse linking in the brain and in the spinal cord. So for us to understand that, then we look at this mechanism, the reflex arc. The reflex arc. An arc can be described as a pathway. An arc is just simply a pathway. We have seen how impulses are going to move, maybe in a rough way, but now we are going to refine it. We are supposed to have receptors in the sense organs. They are stimulated, nerve impulse flows through the sensory neuron, then across the synapse, as we have seen, to relay neuron, across the synapse to motor neuron, and then to effector organ. So that pathway is what we call the arc or reflex arc. But before that, we have to find out the meaning of reflex. They are slightly different. Reflex arc and reflex are different. When you talk of reflex, a very good example is this. If you have a friend closer to you, you can just try to do this. Move a book closer to the eyes, very fast, across, like that. You'll see what happens. If you have done that, you have seen it. There is blinking of the eye. If you have done an experiment of the knee jerk, you can do it at your own time. Unfortunately, I don't have someone closer to me. I could have demonstrated with you. If you hold your leg across another leg like that, let us say that is the other leg, and then you hit that point, the tendons. We have a tendon there, a tendon just below the knee gap, the knee, below the kneecap, and then you hit at that point, you tap. You just tap, maybe using a ruler or something like that. You realize that this leg will jerk forward. It jerks forward. It jerks forward. Why? Because when you hit this tendon, it's going to stimulate the stretch receptors here. The stretch receptors will send an impulse through a sensory neuron to the brain, and then the brain will now interpret and then relay back to the muscles, thigh muscles. Thigh muscles will contract. When it contracts, this leg or the lower limb is going to jerk forward. So we call that one as a knee jerk reaction. So we have said one example of reflex. You pass a book across the face, you realize that somebody will blink. You do this experiment, the leg is going to jerk forward. Sneezing, when you inhale dust, for instance, there will be a reflex of sneezing. Coughing is also a reflex, so that if we have particles that's going down the respiratory system, they come out. When you smell very nice food, the food that we like, or just by sight, there's a reflex that will happen. Salivary glands will secrete a lot of saliva just to prepare your system for purpose of feeding. So those are examples of reflex. So in other words, if you look at the examples that I've mentioned, these are involuntary responses. Whether you like it or not, it's going to happen. When you inhale dust, you cannot, if that urge to sneeze comes, you cannot stop it. You are going to do it, whether you like it or not. So in a simple term, reflex, the meaning of reflex. Reflex is a simple, automatic, rapid response to a stimulus. So the keywords is automatic response to a stimulus. It happens without your voluntary or without your will. Sometimes we call it involuntary. So you can replace that term automatic with involuntary, a simple involuntary rapid response to a stimulus. You have no control. Involuntary means you have no control over it. Examples. Examples we have said, you can look at several examples. When you pass an object across the face, when an object is passed across the face, eyes will blink. Eyes will blink. The knee-jerk reaction is an involuntary reaction, knee-jerk reaction. And we have said how this happens. For you, you can do a demonstration for yourself. When you hit, tap the tendon below the kneecap, the leg jerks forward. You can do this with your friend or a partner. So just take a leg, then you cross over it, and then it hangs a little bit, and then you tap at that point just below the kneecap. You realize that the leg is going to jerk forward. It could not so much, but you realize that it is just going to move forward a little bit. So we have several other examples. We have mentioned involuntary reaction like salivation, vomiting. When you eat bad food, and one of the symptoms of maybe pathogen that causes the disease, we realize that there's vomiting. You cannot prevent it. Vomiting comes. You have no control over it. Coughing. You inhale dust. You are going to sneeze. So we have several examples. So that is a reflex. But now, an arc. Reflex arc. Reflex arc. So it is important that we know what the meaning of reflex. Then we go to reflex arc. So for reflex arc is that pathway through which nerve impulses flows from the receptors through the 3 neurons, as we have mentioned, then back to effectors. And you realize that the 3 neurons are linked either in the spinal cord or in the brain. So that pathway through which the nerve impulse from the receptors to the effectors is what we call the reflex arc. Is a pathway. Keyword, pathway, through which nerve impulse flows from the receptor through neurons to, it will flow through the neurons to effectors, and being linked. The 3 neurons will be linked, being linked in the central nervous system. So to understand the definition, just know that's a pathway. For what? Nerve impulse flowing from the receptor, but it will flow through the neurons, sensory neuron, relay neuron, motor neuron, to effector organs, either glands organs, could be muscles, but all this for the neurons to actually allow transmission of the nerve impulse, it will be being linked, or it will be taking place in the central nervous system. We are going to illustrate how this happens. Illustration of a reflex arc. So to illustrate this, we shall have to get a simplified diagram of the central nervous system, the spinal cord. So this is the transverse section. Of the spinal cord. So this is our major area. So in the spinal cord, and before I move further, reflex action mainly takes place in the lower part of the brain or the spinal cord. So this is a cross-section of the spinal cord. We have other materials covering the spinal cord. Remember where it is found? When we are looking at the skeletal system, we realize that in the vertebral column is where we have the spinal cord. But it has meninges, it's covered with meninges, just like the brain. Meninges are those membranes that covers the brain, and they extend downwards even to the spinal cord. So the upper or the outer part is composed of the meninges. They are double. And then just outside the meninges, we have white matter. White matter. And then in the interior part, we have gray matter. Gray matter. So we are going to find out the reason why it's called white matter and gray matter. And then now this is called the central canal. This central canal contains fluids. The fluids that are found in the brain or in the cavities of the brain extending downwards to the spinal cord. We call that fluid cerebral, spinal fluid. Sometimes abbreviated CSF. Now, when we are looking at parts of the brain, we also looked at CSF. We say that one role of CSF, it contains oxygen and nutrients. Those nutrients are important for nourishing the brain cells and together with the cells of the spinal cord. But now, in this spinal cord, we have a neuron. You can remember that neuron whose body or entirely the structure is found in the central nervous system. So that is the neuron. Now you can give me the name of the neuron. We have described neurons in our previous lesson. We were able to identify one that is entirely found in the central nervous system. This is the neuron. What is the name of that neuron? Yes, you can name it. It is called relay neuron. Relay neuron. And then we have another neuron. You'll also tell me the one that whose cell body is just close. It's just close to the central nervous system, but it is not found. It's just found outside the central nervous system. That neuron. You can remember that neuron where the cell body is off the axon. This is the cell body. That neuron is called sensory neuron. Sensory neuron. Sensory neuron. We are remaining with one neuron whose cell body is found in the central nervous system, but the axon is found outside. That neuron is called motor neuron. Motor neuron. So that root or that position where sensory neuron is located is called dorsal root. Dorsal root. If this is our spinal cord, or let me use my duster here, my eraser that is. If this is the spinal cord and this is the face or the stomach region, and this is the back region, this part shall be called ventral and the back region shall be called dorsal. Dorsal side. Dorsal side, ventral side. So this part is the dorsal root, the back region, if we are doing dissection of the spinal cord. And then this root is called the ventral root. Ventral. Now, having known this, we can now look at the reflex arc. But before we do that, there's something why it should be called the white matter and gray matter. Look at this. You realize that that part we have the cell bodies. This is the white matter, not gray. There's a reason why I should change white. White matter, the gray matter. So the gray matter is usually found outside because of numerous cell bodies. But now, for the white matter, this is due to presence of the very many relay neurons that are found inside this hedge-shaped structure. So let us look at how the reflex arc itself happens. If this is the receptor cells on sense organs, they are going to be stimulated. Nerve impulse will flow through sensory neuron via dorsal root across the synapse, that junction, through the relay neuron, then to the motor neuron, up to effector organs. It could be a muscle or a gland. So that route or that path through which the nerve impulse is flowing through is what we call the reflex arc. Now, suppose we have something like pain. You step on a sharp object, the receptor cells will be stimulated. It generates a nerve impulse. Nerve impulse will flow through sensory neuron and then into the central nervous system through relay neuron. The brain will interpret, and in the process, it will release a motor response to effector organs. So let us use an exact example, our case study, e.g., a case of stepping on hot or sharp. Let us use sharp object. So when you step on a sharp object, these are the following. What will happen is that pain receptors are stimulated. When they are stimulated, they generate a nerve impulse. Generate a nerve impulse. Then a nerve impulse will now flow or be transmitted through sensory neuron. Along sensory neuron. But via dorsal root. To central nervous system. In the central nervous system, the nerve impulse will cross to the relay neuron. Nerve impulse crosses to relay neuron, but across a junction across the synapse. Relay neuron will now allow transmission of nerve impulse to the motor neuron. Nerve impulse is transmitted to motor neuron, but again across a junction, across a synapse. Then in the motor neuron, we are going to have motor response to effector organs. Motor impulse is transmitted to effectors through motor neuron. But remember, via ventral root. In this case, the effectors are the muscles. Effectors being muscles or thigh muscles. Thigh muscles contracts. When it contracts, you pull your leg. Contracts. Then you lift your leg off the sharp object. And remember, this one does not involve thought. You cannot step on a hot object and then you start thinking, should I remove my leg on the hot object or sharp object or not? You cannot debate. There's no debating because it's a reflex, involuntary action, response. Whether you like it or not, that's what you do. So this one does not involve thought. That's why we say simple reflex does not involve learning. You don't have to learn that when you step on a hot object, you will maybe be hurt or be burnt, or when you touch a hot object, you will be burnt. No, that one happens even as a young child or a baby that has not been exposed to the same experience will respond in the same way. Reflex action, resulting to a reflex arc. So with this, it is possible that if you are given any question, you can be able to handle. So let us look at the following, some few questions here. So before we look at the question, just in a nutshell, we have said, you realize that for a reflex arc to happen, you must have the structures in mind. Structures are the receptors, sensory neuron, relay neuron, motor neuron, and the effectors. Once you have those 5 structures in mind, then it becomes easy for you to describe a reflex arc. So first question is here, define the following terms. Define the following terms. One, reflex. Reflex. So we have already gone through it and it has been very easy. We have said once you come across the word reflex, know that that's an automatic involuntary response. A response that you have no control over it. So we can simply define it again as an automatic or involuntary, rapid, is very fast, rapid response to a specific stimulus. Specific stimulus. Stimulus is the change in the environment. Another question, another definition, reflex arc. For this to happen, we must have a reflex arc. So reflex arc, we have said, is the route, the pathway through which nerve impulse flows along the 3 neurons from the receptors to effectors. Nerve impulses are transmitted through which nerve impulses are transmitted along the neurons from receptors in the sense organs to effectors. So just to emphasize a little bit, receptors. Receptors, a little emphasis, receptors. Those are structures that have numerous nerve cells, the one that they detect change in the environment, receptors. Effectors, they execute the command by the brain. In other words, they are the one that brings about response. So this one they detect a change in the environment. Effectors, they respond to the change. They are the one that will help to respond to the change. So the receptors could be the sensory nerve endings in the skin, pain detectors, thermoreceptors. Effectors could be the muscles, the one that will contract to pull your arm off a hot object or a leg off a sharp object. Question number 2. Describe a reflex arc in the following situation. Describe a reflex arc. A reflex arc when bright light, not one, when bright light is shown into the eyes. So this question, you can illustrate it using your friend. You'll see what will happen. If a very bright light is shown into your eyes, you realize that there'll be somebody will try to first blink, and then if you look at the pupil, it will have reduced in size. There'll be some form of mechanism to reduce the size of the pupil. So this is what we want to describe. We are going to describe it using a flowchart. So when a bright light is shown into the eyes, first of all, we have to identify the stimuli. The stimuli here is light. So light. We put there light. It stimulates some receptors in the eye. But specific receptors in the eye are found in the retina, and they are called photoreceptors. So photoreceptors are stimulated. Photoreceptors in the eye are stimulated. When photoreceptors are stimulated, a nerve impulse is generated. Nerve impulse is generated. So a nerve impulse is formed. When a nerve impulse is formed, it will flow through sensory neuron and specific neurons in the eye. When you look at the structure of the eye, we mentioned that nerve. That nerve was called optic nerve. So nerve impulse is generated, then it flows through sensory neuron. Sensory neuron. In this specific case, optic nerve. So optic nerve. So it will flow through optic nerve. And then to the central nervous system. Central nervous system, where we have now the relay neuron. Relay neuron. There will be interpretation of the kind of light that is reaching the eye, whether it is too high or of medium intensity. And then now a motor impulse will flow through motor neuron. 2. Effectors. But in this case, the effectors are still in the eye, the muscles of the iris. So, muscles of iris. Remember the muscles of iris? We had radial muscle, and circular muscles. So if it is, let me use that diagram there. If this is, we have radial muscles here, circular muscles here, what will happen is that radial muscles are going to relax. Radial muscles relaxes. Contract, that is. It is going to contract, not relax. Contracts. Contracts. When it contracts, what will happen is going to pull this direction, and the circular muscles are going to relax. When they relax, the size of the pupil decreases. So the effect size of pupil decreases. When it decreases, it's going to allow less light into the eye. So you can look at several other examples. Apart from light being shown, you can look at other examples, like if, for example, bad smell is released into a room, you can also try to describe the reflex arc. Sensory, maybe the receptors for smell in the nose will detect, will be stimulated, generating a nerve impulse, and then it flows the way we have been able to go through the other arc. So you can describe several other arcs depending on the stimuli. So up to there, I hope you have been able to enjoy the lesson, and in the near future, if you're asked the same, you'll be able to correctly answer the same questions. Thank you.